Good morning. Welcome to Bread and Wine. My name is Tyson. I am so glad you are with us this morning. Before we begin, there's a few things I wanted to draw your attention to. The first being whether you are brand new to us and are just finding us online, or you've been at Bread and Wine and worshiping with us for a while, we are trying out a new platform this week for streaming our service. We are still putting the video on YouTube as normal, but if you could go to the link that you will find here, you will find a new platform, and on this platform will give us the ability to discuss the sermon as it takes place, the ability to ask for prayer requests confidentially, and also be able to use a Bible app in real time and other things that will be able to help us better engage with one another as we continue to worship virtually. We would love to hear any feedback you might have. Those of you that are members, feel free to reach out to me, Tyson, on Slack at any time with any comments or thoughts or feedback. I'm happy to take those as well. Without further ado, let's worship together. Our call to worship and our scripture for the sermon this morning is coming from Psalm 22, verses 23 to 31. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you offsprings of Jacob, glorify him, and stand in awe of him, all you offspring of Israel. For he has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, and he has not hidden his face from him, but he has heard when he cried to him. From you comes my praise in the great congregation. My vows I will perform before those who fear him. The afflicted shall eat and be satisfied, and those who seek him shall praise the Lord. May your hearts live forever. All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord. And all the families of the nations shall worship before you. For kingship belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. All the prosperous of the earth eat and worship. Before him shall bow all who go down to the dust, even the ones who would not keep himself alive. Posterity shall serve him. It shall be told of the Lord to the coming generation. They shall come and proclaim his righteousness to a people yet unborn, that he has done it. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Hello, Bread and Wine. This is your pastor, Sharad, and we are back again during the season of Lent. This is the second Sunday in Lent, and we have been focusing deeply on this important question of suffering, like we do every Lent. But this year is a little bit different because it feels like Lent has lasted since last March, and people have been going through it with different kinds of difficulties in their own lives in this pandemic and the political climate that we've weathered in so many different ways, that we wanted to be very specific this Lent about what we're trying to do. And that is not just to suffer, but to carry our cross in suffering, to suffer with Jesus. And that means seeing how we can become a blessing inside our own struggles to other people. And so, of course, we said, well, who best to learn that from? Who better than Indigenous brothers and sisters and the Black church tradition, which we really wanted to focus on during this season. And so we started with a conversation with my brother Eric Knox last week. And this week we've got a friend of mine named Michael Gonzalez. Hey, Michael.
What's going on? So
Michael and I are going to have a conversation that we hope is helpful for you. But before we do that, you'll notice we've only been reading the Psalms in the lectionary for these Sundays. And we're focusing on the Psalms from the lectionary because we're treating the Black tradition as a wisdom tradition, which is what in some ways it is. It is deep theology and deep biblical insight that emerges from human experience. And that's very much what the Black church tradition has to offer us is insight and wisdom that comes from a lived experience of carrying the cross with Jesus. And so I thought, well, if we're going to do that, if we're going to look there to figure out how to become a blessing in suffering, we need to start with experiences. So that's why we're having conversations and not just lectures on these kinds of topics. And I really couldn't think of anyone better in my in my circle of people that I listen to and read and think with than Michael, because I ran into Michael. We do have real life connections with real human beings. So there's a fellow in our Soma network of churches, which is what Bread and Wine used to be associated with, a church network called Soma. And one of the people I met in that network was a fellow that Michael is now ministering with inside their church setting. And I'll let you say more, Michael, about your own church setting, but most of my connection with Michael has been on Facebook. And the reason I just love the guy from the beginning of seeing him posting on topics related to race is how fiercely, first of all, what a fierce and voracious reader the dude is. He swallows books whole. He's like me in that he, tell me if I'm speaking out of turn here, but I think you work out your anxieties in books where it's like, oh man, I haven't even thought about this. And then you go and buy a book. And so we're like blood brothers with that. But also there's this vulnerability with Michael in struggling through these difficult issues in public where it's like, I'm going to put myself out there and let people watch me struggle, and hopefully they learn. And that posture is what makes me love him without ever having met him, and why I feel like I just want to know him better and connect with him more. And so this is like the first time we've talked in person, and I'm kind of glad to be able to share that with other people because I just really appreciate the guy. Do you remember how we first encountered one another, Michael? And do you want to say something by way of introduction of yourself?
I really don't remember. We've been Facebook friends for a long time.
Yeah.
For a lot of people that I know who I haven't met, I'm like, it kind of blends in. It's been years.
Yeah. It feels like we know each other better than we do, maybe.
Yeah. In fact, my friend Gino, who I'm, serving with,
Mm-hmm.
we met through Facebook, or I think Twitter. We met through Twitter.
Crazy.
Yeah. So I lived in South Carolina at the time. Met him, we would just talk back and forth. Eventually, we would, talk about different things about making disciples. He was up here in Jersey. I was in South Carolina. And then eventually we were like, hey, we should do some work together. So we moved up, me and my family, we moved up and eventually did that. So.
Wow, that's so nuts, man. Yeah. And Gino wasn't even in, you all are like an Anglican church, right?
No.
Oh, you're not.
We're not a part of the Anglican church. I was doing some work with the Anglican church yesterday.
That's right. Yeah. So you guys it's an independent church, but you're not with Soma Communities anymore, right?
I don't think we ever were. I just think that a lot of the work that he did was very similar.
Yeah.
And he did a lot of work with them, learning from them.
Yeah.
I don't think he was ever a part of Soma.
Yeah. I think he was in a Soma in Soma, Philly, with a guy named Rob for a little while before he moved on.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Well, yeah, man. I'm actually pumped to see you in person. Because it's I have your voice is silkier than what I pictured when I read your posts. But yeah, you kind of heard where we're going for Lent and this theme around suffering and I in some ways, I was kind of conflicted about coming to the Black church tradition to look at suffering, because there's kind of like, there's a way in which I feel like a lot of the genius of the Black church, even though it was forged in the context of suffering, it's so much more than just adversity. And the way that in my reading, I've seen this just such profound insight into what it means to be a human being, kind of come out of a lot of the people that I've read. But do you have a direct experience with the Black church tradition, or is that something that you came into after your conversion? What's your relationship to the Black church?
Yeah, as early as I can remember being alive, I was part of the Black church.
Yeah.
I think the earliest memories I can think of was when I was like 4 or 5, and
Huh.
we lived in California, and we was a part of a black church. And then we moved. My dad was in the military. We moved to Havelock, North Carolina,
Hmm.
and I basically was in the black church throughout my whole life up until around 20 years old.
Hmm. Wow. So when you kind of came into um, uh, a white evangelical setting, what was that like? Because if you're kind of raised and nurtured in this environment, I know from reading your posts and seeing a lot of your comments, you're familiar with white evangelicalism. When did that happen?
Yeah, so I eventually joined the military myself,
Hmm.
and so that's what took me from my home church, and just being a young military person, you're on the base. So I remember just looking up churches in the phone book, like that's I'm dating myself a little bit.
Yeah. What's a
Call,
phone book?
I didn't even have a car, so my initial church experience, when I left, was still black church.
Hmm.
But then there's this thing called Christian hip hop. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
But
There's a lot of that in Portland. So
that was a kind of a gateway for me into white evangelicalism, because white evangelicalism used a lot of those artists to kind of push forward some of their theology and some of their doctrine. And through white evangelicalism, or through Christian hip hop, I was exposed to that. And they would talk about John Piper, and they would talk about Backpack, with Johnny Mac, all that. And that's when I began to read these people. And I think around that time, I'm kind of trying to I'm on my own, so I'm like kind of making the faith my own. Like, who am I apart from my church? Kind of thinking through that.
Yeah.
But
that's your 20s, right? That's like your early.
That was my early 20s, and so that music kind of was like, I really respected these men.
Yep.
So I took on to what they were talking about and the figures that they were kind of, and that actually led me out of the black church. I actually, the deeper I listened to their music, the more I thought I need to leave the black church in order to enter a space where I could, hear the theology that I was learning from them.
Wow.
And that's actually what led, it was actually Christian hip hop, black artists, that led me out of the black church into white evangelical spaces.
Man, that's so interesting, because for a lot of white evangelical folks, they would look at something like Christian hip hop and think that's a window into the black church or something.
Yeah.
Like as though it represents, instead of it being conforming to something else.
Yeah, it was complete opposite.
Wow.
I went out, and then the more I kind of immersed in the spaces, the first predominantly white church I was in was a Presbyterian church. And it, everybody was like in their 60s. I was like the only black person in there. There's like one black woman, and they were really hospitable, but it was a shock. And I was just like, what is going on? Where
am I? Yeah.
But around that time, I had already began to think that the core of my faith was having this precision, sharp doctrine.
Okay. So say more about that. Let's back up, because, this formation that you had in the black church before you sort of entered those predominantly white evangelical spaces, you probably, it sounds like you had, looking back, once you entered white spaces, like a completely different interpretation of your experience in those places.
Absolutely.
But before that ever came into your mind, what was it like for you? How would you have described your experience in the black church growing up?
It's funny. I wouldn't even thought of it as the black church. It was just church.
It's just church. Yep.
Like I didn't think, oh, I'm a part of the black church. Like, I just thought this is just my church experience. In fact, our church, we would, sometimes visit other churches, and there would be other black churches, but sometimes we'd visit white churches. Yeah. And I actually liked them because they got out much earlier. So as the kid, I was just like, oh, we go back to Liberty.
Please.
We got out at like 12:30. I'm like, now I can go play basketball. In the black church, we're getting out 2:30. We have a guest speaker.
Right.
We're gonna be there till 3.
Right.
And so Yeah. So growing up, I'd never thought deeply about what it meant to be a part of the Black church. It just
Mm,
nurtured me and shaped me.
mm,
And a lot of it kind of was just like over my head. It wasn't until I got older that I looked back and
mm,
I began to see what they were doing and the kinds of like the institutions that they built, and then
yeah.
realized, oh,
Mm,
a lot of the things that what I see, the struggles in the white church, this kind of sacred secular divide that didn't exist growing up.
wow. Mm,
Like we're building businesses that my mom worked at that helped us.
mm,
And I'm, part of like, a quality daycare that they built, an education system that they
wow.
built. And
Mm,
I'm like, that was just the life of our church. It
yeah.
wasn't like this. I didn't hear debates about justice. I never heard about that. That only happened in, white evangelical spaces. So
Wow. Wow, man. Yeah, that's so interesting because I feel like, I mean, in some ways, I know how negative it can sound to talk about contrast with those experiences, I know that there is like this hypersensitivity in certain white evangelical contexts about the critique that people of color brought to bear on their thing, and even talking about it like their thing is shocking
right.
for some
Yeah.
people. It's like, what do you mean our thing? This is just the thing. This is just the church. And but it seems like the what you just called church growing up was so radically different than the wall you hit when you came into those settings. Looking back on that change, that transition,
Yeah.
how would you compare the way suffering and adversity was handled
Oh yeah.
in these two different settings? You know what I mean? Like, is there a contrast or
two different ways? Because in the white predominant churches, suffering is like you just endure it. Right? Your sign of maturity, one was how much suffering you endured, right? So, you're listening to particular pastors, like there's that kind of martyr theology where it's like, we're suffering for Jesus, and you like want to suffer almost in order to feel like,
right.
Paul is like, hey, the godly will suffer persecutions. Like, well, I'm not suffering, so
I better
like, and in the Black church, it's, suffering, it was just, it's just a part of our human experience. But the angle was how do we create spaces of life in the midst of the suffering? So there was an endurance, but we didn't see the suffering as something that God was bringing in order to kind of elevate our spiritual authority or spiritual, like in our sense of like, I'm godly because I'm suffering, but it's like, how do we build life in the midst of that? Right? How do we care for one another in the midst of that? And so it was different, right? It was different than simply, you suffer. And like, so I kind of learned to suppress suffering and to not name it as suffering, or to not even think, I don't like this. This shouldn't, or even resist it. Right.
Yeah.
Like it, this is just a part of my lot. Whereas in the church that I grew up, it's like, well, if people don't have jobs, let's create business. So
here's what's interesting, man. You just said let's. So let us.
Yeah.
Blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And it seems to me that growing up in an Indian family, growing up with where my parents immigrated, they latched onto their real friends, which were all of the Indian community in the Boise area where we grew up. And there was a sense in which, like, being a part of that group of people, like, all of their shit was your shit, all of their struggling was your struggling. If like, there's just no question that if like, oh, your cousin is like dealing with some, he's having a hard time in school, then we're all going to try to figure out what to do to help that kid. There's like a sense in which there's this shared experience. So adversity is, without thinking about it, no one had a conversation about it, but suffering was a shared experience, and man, the way in which you don't even know what the guy next to you is going through in a white church context, or how difficult it is to break into what people are dealing with, the privacy of it.
Yeah.
It's a weird barrier that I've noticed in a lot of ethnic worship contexts. The let us do this about it isn't even possible because they don't share their suffering very well. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That I don't fully understand where that dynamic comes from. It's strange to me that would be the case, especially in light of our baptism, right? As Christians, like that just feels like a contradiction that they our suffering will be understood in terms of private.
Yeah.
Like that doesn't make sense to me. And I think, I mean, as I guess, thinking of the theology that I learned, I guess it makes sense because your suffering was kind of like a sign of your faithfulness almost.
Yeah. But unpack that more. Like,
yeah. So I remember, so when I began to read some of the Reformed thinkers, I read a lot of the missionaries, right, and the martyrs, and the Jesus freaks, and I'm pretty sure you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, like, I used to listen to those sermons. I used to listen to sermons that would talk about suffering almost like an addict. like lay it on me. Come on. Lay it on me. Like,
it's funny, as you're talking, I actually have this weird memory of in the Bible church that I was in, when we would hear preaching that was convicting, we would just talk about how convicting it was. Like, it was like,
exactly.
Like it was like, that's the spirituality, that in the hurt that I just experienced in it.
Yeah. Instead of like that actual coming together to care for one another and build life and resist the suffering, which is the, like when you think of the scriptures and you think of like James, James talks about count it all joy. In the evangelical space, I never made sense of that. I'm like, all suffering, but when you think of being a person who's oppressed and you have no power to change your position, your joy work will look a lot different, right? It will take the suffering and will aim it towards some form of redemption, some form of joy, using the suffering without justifying it, in order to sustain you, right?
Wow.
And what I realized, if I come at it with that perspective, it makes so much sense. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's exactly what I saw my mother doing all the time.
Yeah.
My mother was doing that. But I think when I was a child, I just saw it and I never thought twice about it. But when I got older, as I'm an adult and I have children and I'm leading and I'm suffering and it's not ending, and I'm like, what do I do? And I'm like, I had to go back to the wisdom of the church that I grew up in. I had to think really deeply about my mother and how she lived, because it was almost like I pushed all that to the side as irrelevant as I kind of entered those other spaces. And it's I had to recover their voice.
Right. Yeah, you had to like go dust it off this thing that you were told doesn't have anything for you. Like,
it's like you go in the attic and you're like, oh, look at these journals and look at these experiences. And I remember my mother waking up in the morning and praying and having music and journaling like every day, and I'm like, what was that about? I just like mom's praying again. But now I'm like, now that I'm older, I'm like, oh, we lived in section 8. Like, my little brother, I was talking to him the other day. He was like, thinking about mom and her crying because of just how hard things were. And I'm like, but she always made sure we had what we needed.
Right.
And she did whatever sacrifices was needed. And then thinking, she worked at the church, the daycare that my church started. And it's like all clicking. I'm like, oh man. That's what, like, when I went to the daycare, I didn't see it as a different entity of my church. It was still the elders who were there. It was still the people in the church who were working there. And so it just felt like, oh, we got bigger.
Right.
Wow. But I never realized, like, oh, they're actually meeting needs.
Right. Yeah. Okay. What you just described is, is just so different in the mindset than you know, than the way that white evangelical spaces work, where ministry is sort of defined around very specific purposes. It's like, what's the reason for our church? Well, our church exists because, you know, we're trying to do these three things, you know, we're trying to accomplish these three things, or these ministries exist because they're trying to meet these particular needs, you know. But everything can be, it's almost like the way a lot of people sort of criticize the church being like a business. No matter how relational it feels, it always feels like a business, in that if the structure went away, these people would have nothing to do with each other.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That's how it feels. It's almost like, well, if we didn't meet every Sunday, in fact, you think about, why are so many Christian churches, particularly white evangelical churches, saying we need to get together during this pandemic? What is the reason for this anti-mask, let's get together no matter what? Well, it's because they're afraid if they don't meet, they won't have a church anymore. Right? I'm sensing that's not how it was in the churches you grew up in.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about the Black church was born in crisis. It was born in suffering, and it was a necessary thing in order to carve out a space of survival.
Yeah.
Right? You think of the Hush Harbors in the beginning, not even institutional Black church, but Hush Harbors. They're escaping in order for spiritual renewal. They're organizing. They're lamenting. This is a space where they can have fun and dance and get outside of the white gaze.
Right.
And so it brings together all facets of life. It's not just gathering for a song. It's gathering to survive.
Wow. Yeah.
And that's a different mode of being together than simply coming together because you know.
Right.
Because you have to do something on Sunday.
Right. Yeah. You know, and your description of a church that says, well, we exist because this community exists. It's like you can't separate those two things. It's like the community and the church, that's why they're one thing. And so, of course, we're going to try to lift people out of poverty. We're going to try to empower people to take care of their families. We're going to do more than just sing a song on Sunday and hear a word that helps me get through my week. But it seems like, you know, when we, like the Psalm that we read this morning was from Psalm 22. And one of the things I noticed about it was this kind of solidarity that exists inside the logic of it. You know, it says, you who fear the Lord, praise him. All you offspring of Jacob, glorify him. Stand in awe of him, all you offspring of Israel, for he did not despise or abhor the affliction of the afflicted. He did not hide his face from me, that's individual, but heard when I cried to him. And then he says, from you comes my praise in the great congregation. So there's this logic of solidarity. Your solidarity with Israel is your solidarity to me personally, and your solidarity with me is connected to your solidarity with the afflicted. So we're all one thing. So my suffering isn't separated from their suffering. You know, the suffering of the afflicted isn't separated from my situation. And it seems to me that a lot of the culture of white evangelicalism, there's me and my suffering, and then there's mission, which is their suffering, you know? And there's like this strong separation between the two. You know what I'm saying?
Yes. I mean, I think because when you think about Black church, we're talking about race, and race fundamentally groups people together, right? But Black people, they're together because, like, on the plantation, because they're Black.
Yeah.
They're not white and they're suffering. And so, like, it's kind of like a forced condition. It's like you have to do that.
Yeah.
But I think today the racial reasoning continues to cause us to not see our connectedness with others. And I think that's what the psalmist and what I think Jesus is constantly trying to do is help us reimagine who we are connected to. Right. So obviously the people of Israel, they are a people, rescued out of slavery and then formed into a people. But racial identity was about pulling people together, causing some to suffer while others don't suffer. And I feel it seems like our responsibility today is to allow our baptism to do the kind of work it was meant to do, which is to help us reimagine who we're connected to, who we belong to. I think that's really the challenge.
Yeah, it's a powerful thought. And I mean, in some ways, I think people can get their arms around it when you think really personally, and you think, okay, what happens when if my brother, if his marriage were to fall apart, like I wouldn't even think about it. Like, that's my problem. I would be texting him. I'd be like, where are you sleeping tonight? And I would be involved, because he's my people,
Yeah.
So how do we get there outside our tribal, racial, personal circle? How do we see our suffering turn into solidarity?
Yeah.
Instead of hunkering down.
One of the things that I do in my church is helping tell the story of how race was created. Because a lot of us, we've just accepted racial identities as a God-given reality, instead of this happened inside Christian discourse in order to displace indigenous peoples and enslave African peoples, and ultimately to divide, right? And so we have to talk about the racial nature of the church now, and the racial nature of this country, so that we can help kind of pull apart the way race shapes who we sense our sense of belonging and connectedness to, and do that explicitly, so then we can retell the story of Jesus and say, mentioning the story of my brother, something's going on with my brother. Well, Jesus is like, who are my mothers, my brothers and sisters, those who do the will of God. And so even Jesus in his own ministry is redrawing the lines of connection, and he's connecting people together. And we have to tell that story. We have to name that we belong together, and that Jesus is trying to help us to build a shared life together. A shared life that's fundamental to who we are,
right,
as followers of Jesus. But the racial condition has subverted that work,
right,
and we kind of just go along with that.
Yeah, man. I mean, I feel like that's a lifetime to unpack, and when I think about where we sit as a church, where Bread and Wine sits as a church, like the brothers and sisters watching and thinking along these topics with us are mostly white folks. And the class differences in our church are probably bigger than the race differences in our church, if I look at the lines inside of it. And they reflect Portland more generally, which is, a very white city but when I think about what it means for the church to be the church in these spaces, what you're describing, well, our baptism should work against this stuff. And, as we are thinking through that this Lent, as we're in quarantine, our lives have all shrunk down to just our families and ourselves, and these things that all white Christians are very familiar with, that we know are bad things. Hyper individualism, it's a bad thing. Consumerism, it's a bad thing. I think one of the things they don't know in that story is how things like hyper individualism, consumerism is part of a larger story of race, of whiteness, there's a reason why the black church is this way and the white church is that way, And I wonder if you could speak more to that. Why should we look to the black church as white folks in our church? Why should they look to the black church to learn how to create solidarity?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things about the black church, it's a miracle. When you think about the level of affliction that black people endured.
Mhm.
And what you see is, I mean, everything was working against Black people, right? Even Christianity working against them.
Yeah.
And you see them taking hold of the scriptures and then creatively using it as a means of liberation, right? So there's not grasping for perfection or control or theological precision, but it's this improv work of seeing the story and saying, oh, hold up.
Huh.
There's all these themes of liberation, and you just see this kind of creative retrofitting of the faith as a means of liberation. And so what you see in the Black church is this creative, versatile, adaptable people who are constantly resisting evil, right? Without being overtaken by evil, right? Overcoming evil with good, right?
Yeah.
Just yesterday in the talk that I mentioned with you, I talked about how Black was originally a horrible thing.
Yeah.
Right? Like those enslaved Africans would not have identified themselves as Black. It was a forced identity. But what do you see them doing? You see them taking that identity and turning it into something else, right? Into something that could be full of dignity. And now,
totally,
when black people, now children are coming up, they're going to have a different story because of that hard work of those first persons and groups who did that work, not knowing where they would be tomorrow,
right?
But having hope that this Jesus who suffers with us, if God would not abandon him, then God is with us, giving us that hope. It's like you see what kind of thing can happen.
Yeah.
And it's like, why would you not learn from a tradition who did that? Like when you think of democracy in this country, you know, we could debate whether it really is, but any resemblance of democracy has always been pushed by Black people.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like a lot of people think of Black people and it's like, why don't Black people want revenge?
Yeah.
Like if all
we were just talking about this last week. Yeah.
It's like they're not getting revenge. They're like, we actually want to abolish this horrible system, right? So you already have this abolitionist work within the Black church of breaking down systems of violence, which is core to our faith, core to Jesus's teaching, and them actually saying, "Hey, let's build a better world."
Yeah, right.
And
Like, not just a better Black community.
Yes, a better world, which is. Yes, there is a centering of the Black struggle, but your freedom is connected to this.
Right.
Like your freedom is connected to our freedom. And so there's already that sense, because if we just carve out this little space in the Hush Harbor, that was enough to organize, but we don't want to stay in, you don't want to stay in the Hush Harbor. You want to be able to move freely.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And it's like, so that's all that kind of work that happened. And it's like, why would you not learn from that movement? Like, why when you think of church, you want to go straight to the first century? Because it's in this country where you see, with the racial character and the capitalistic character, you see the Black church enduring and carving out life in creative ways.
It's so interesting, man, because there's so much push to do community in white churches, you know, so much of a realization that we can't just have curriculum anymore. We have to do real communal life together. And there's all this resurgence of like you don't do mission on your own, you do it in a community. You don't read scripture just on your own, you do it in a communal setting. This push for community has been, like, the last decade and a half has been like nothing. It's the only word you hear, in white church settings: community. But when you think, well, how do we even know what that word means and how to do it? You have to be in spaces where people really have a community. They don't have to talk about it. They don't have to read a book about it. They just know how to do it. And those spaces are not white spaces of people who learn how to do it. They're, ask your Latinx, neighbors whether they worry about how to do community. They don't.
Right.
my family didn't worry about how to do community. They just found people and did their lives together,
Yeah. Yeah.
And so yeah, dude, I feel like, you know, there's a sense in which a lot of white evangelical churches don't even think about that as a resource because they're afraid of the politics. They're afraid of the politics of those churches.
And here's the reality. Being black is a political act.
Whoa, say more about that.
Because in this country, black people emerged as, chattel. So to want to, define one's own self-agency was already a resistance against the dominant political order. And so, being black in this country and trying to literally change the core of this country has always been a political act. And I think that's one of the things. It's never been, and I'm obviously there. It's not like everything that has come out of the black church has been like this, spit shine perfect thing. Right. But it's like those things have never been split apart, because in this country, being black is life and death for most people, unless certain levels of class can kind of protect you in some regards, but it's much harder to pick and choose if you care about that or not, because politics is all about how do we live together.
Yeah.
That's all politics is. The Christian faith is a politic.
Yeah.
It is how must we live together? How will we live together? Right? Yeah. The kingdom of God has its own politic. And so we have to, like the black church knew that like instinctively, but in our country, we kind of live in these binary categories, and we have to kind of not necessarily bring church and state together, but we have to reimagine what kind of life we're going to live together. And I think this COVID time of being separate gives us an opportunity to kind of talk about, like, how will we live together, or how do we want to live together?
Yeah.
When this passes, I think it's a great time, and we need to use technology as we're using even today to kind of be creative.
Yeah.
Right. Creative to connect. Right. There are all types of things happening online where people can begin to sit and listen to Black voices and brown voices and learn. And it's not weird, because it's like in COVID, this is what we're doing. We're Zooming.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So I was like, hey, let's hit up a stranger in Philly, somebody I've never seen in real life, and we'll have him lead this morning.
I've had so many conversations with people who I haven't met all across the world because of COVID. And I'm like, but that's the improv, right? Yeah. Like we can't control COVID. Right. We can't control, right? So we have to take what is it given to us and try to make the best. It's not perfect. Right. It's still suffering. Right. Like, talking with you is amazing, but it doesn't wash over the desire to like actually sit next to you face to face. Of course. But we're doing the best we can. And I think that's one of the things that I think the Black church has helped me to think through is you can't always control suffering. And I think that individualism gives people a sense of control. Oh, which is why we look for individualism. Yeah. That's so true. And then suffering also kind of intensifies that, because even in COVID, suffering separates us. Yeah. Right. And so this is the thing about, to me, it is such a crucial moment for the church, it feels like to me, because it's a chance to learn how adversity can create connection instead of disconnection. Yeah. And how your own personal inconvenience or whatever, all of a sudden these are not adequate categories for how to live your life. I mean, that's why some people can't figure out the mask thing. They literally don't know that what they choose to do or not do, they don't think that should have any effect on anybody else. They just don't think that way. So it's like, well, it's my face, I can wear a mask if I want. It's like, yeah, but we share the same air, man. Like, and that's why it's predominantly a problem you see for white people, Going back to the race piece, because one of the things that race racial reasoning has done, it has disconnected our sense of connection to space and land. And so we feel as if we're contained solely on our bodies, because that's what racial identity did to indigenous peoples, was it displaced them and pulled their identity from the land.
Yeah, into just their...
And to just me, myself, contained on my body. You see me, you see all of me.
Yeah.
Right? What I see is all of my responsibility. And part of the work of overcoming that is not even just rethinking our relationship to people, but our relationship to land and space, and realizing that we have a kind of accountability where we live to care for the space, not just to care for our individual selves.
Well, yeah. Wow. I mean, and that's a level of solidarity that encompasses very different sorts of people, because if you care for a space, you don't get to choose who those people are in that space.
Yeah. So part of the work is helping people connect and imagine their connection to land and reimagine their connection to people.
Yeah.
And then to suffer together.
Yeah.
In that work.
Yeah. Dude, that's so rich, and there's so much to think about. I want, as we kind of transition to the communion and benediction, all the rest of that we're going to do next, to me, my eyes are on the future with these topics. Like, I think what you said about how people need a story to understand why we are this way. Why is it so hard to connect to each other? Why do I see my life as just me and my body and the people I choose to bring it in contact with? A story is so important. But then now we're writing a story right now in what we do and how we do it. So I think about future generations, and our commitment to them. How do you think our way of handling this stuff now will shape who the church really is in the future?
Yeah, I think the possibilities are just boundless.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think we'll really know just how deep and how wide those ramifications are. To think like us doing that kind of work, I think it would have incredible impact in the future if we would begin to do that now in the present and really think deeply, like, why are we here? And what is our sense of connection here? And how do we form that sense of connection? And as you said, storytelling is one of the most important ways that we can, because even individualism and race is a story, right? It is a story about who you are, who you're connected to, what your purpose in life is. And Jesus is constantly bringing and drawing people together, knitting story together, knitting people together who shouldn't be together or who wouldn't normally want to be together.
Yeah.
And I think we need to, like, leaders need to help people realize, like, your story is Jesus wants to weave us together.
Yeah.
Weave us together so that we might be building a shared life in a place. And the beauty of story is that stories can change. And so even if you look at your story and it's like, oh, it's kind of crappy, I'm living an individualistic story.
Yeah.
That story's changeable.
Yeah. Right. You don't have to live in it.
Right. You don't have to live in it. You can change and you can say, I want to live different.
Yeah.
I don't know how to do that, but I'm willing to do that with you. And I think we can begin there, and we can begin to take these individual stories and the shared suffering, like we really are in a real way experiencing a shared suffering.
Yeah.
But we need to lock arms with people digitally. Right?
Yeah.
And begin to let this draw us together and to begin to care for one another and hopefully build something out of that.
Man, that's such a good word. And the last words of this psalm are, posterity will serve him. Future generations will be told about the Lord and proclaim his deliverance to a people yet unborn, saying that he has done it.
Yes.
It's so good. It's so good. That's like that. Why else would we even continue this struggle we're trying to figure out if that's not, I mean, that's what we're living into. Future generations will be told the Lord, and posterity will serve him. So
Yes.
I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful for your story. And maybe actually, if as we close, this might be putting you on the spot, but do you have a story of connection in COVID that that could serve us? You know, that that's like, yeah, in the midst of all these opportunities to be disconnected, look at how God creates connection and can.
Oh, yeah. So the church that I'm with now, so I'm kind of going back now. So I moved to Philly to help start this church. Within about 2 years, we actually left. It didn't work out.
Oh,
and there was a rift in the relationship. So I actually reconnected to a Black church.
Wow.
Which was pretty conservative, and it was not necessarily, it was a wonderful time, but I knew that the kind of work that I wanted to do would have been a little different from this church. During that gap, me and my friend, we reconciled.
Wow.
Yeah, we reconciled, and we restarted last year, January. So most of my time back with the church has been in COVID.
You're insane.
Yeah. And the community that I'm a part of, so it was a larger community. And when we began to realize, oh, COVID's going to last a lot longer.
Yeah.
We multiplied because we was already in the process of training another person. So that person, we sent them off and they have their own community. So the community that I'm a part of right now, some of the people I've only been with face to face, maybe, well, not, I won't say twice because we were meeting outside during the summer. But I'll just say I'm still getting to know a lot of the people in the community.
Wow.
And I've been with many which are strangers now forming relationships with people through Zoom.
Yeah.
And we're talking about how will we live together. So we're talking about race. We're talking about the events that happen. We're grieving. We're trying to find ways to do little game nights through Zoom.
Sure.
And we are just doing our best. Sometimes, like, we just confess, this just feels so inadequate. I don't know what I'm doing. And we're just doing it together.
Yeah.
And
so
and one of the things that we're helping narrate for people is this is the work. This is the work. It doesn't always feel like it's enough because it's not.
Right. Yeah. Like, and by the way, this thing we're feeling where we don't have any control, like, that's an instructive thing. That's not a terrible thing.
Yes. So we're turning this suffering into a shared suffering. And you know, as people have been getting, like, we haven't had too many COVID cases, but you know, when people are struggling economically, you know, there's shared prayer, and there's, you know, people doing meal trains and people, you know, checking in, and we're turning this and we're constantly talking about this as a shared life.
Yeah.
That's the thing that we constantly talk about is we are looking to build a life together. Yeah. And so how do we do that? And that means the good, the bad, the ugly, the boring, the exciting. Right. Like, we're going to do that together. And that has been a very rich time. Wow. Some of it, you know, a lot of it feels very ordinary. Like, we're like, you know, on Zoom for an hour, people are zoomed out, but we're like, we're going to do it because we want to be together. Right. And we're like, you know what? This didn't really feel like much. It just felt like another meeting, but we're doing it together. Right. We're doing it together. And we're constantly naming that, naming that, because suffering, it could just be so easy to pull apart and then just kind of look inward. Yes. Like, we are resisting that together. We're resisting the temptation to just pull away, sit on the couch, watch movies, and just, you know, burn your brain out by, you know, binge watching TV shows. Like, totally.
I mean, although there is a fair amount of that's
for sure. I've watched many TV series, but we're actively resisting it. Yeah, and we're finding creative ways, and it's been hard, but it's also been this strange thing where it's like we actually have another community who's doing the same thing. It's like, y'all, we're building community through technology, which is not easy. Yeah, it's not what we want, but that's the thing, because no one wants suffering.
That's right. So like you said, let's name it and
Right.
then do the work inside of it.
Right.
Yeah, dude, such a good word, and I'm so grateful that you took time to be with us.
Yeah.
Seeing connections like this forward, it's not the last time we'll see your face, I'm sure of it. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing with us.
Absolutely, man. This has been great. It's been real fun being able to talk with you.
Yeah, same. All right, thanks, Michael.
All right.
Bread and wine, receive this benediction. May the Almighty and merciful Lord direct us in this new direction and new work. May he make it prosper and maintain us in peace, that we share his generous love and mercy to all along our path. May the Holy Spirit intercede and accompany us along the way, that we live our lives to serve as Christ served all and breathe peace, joy, and love into our homes, neighborhoods, and city. We go forth, therefore, in the name of the Father, in the name of the Son, and in the name of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Bread and wine, go in peace.